Hi everyone, and welcome to our webinar, A Modern Approach to EHS Investigations, Understanding the Psychology of Witness Memory and Recall. My name is Greta Salverson, Content Lead here at Notify Technology. Today I'm joined by Elizabeth Hyde, founder of HESPA GRC, and former health and safety lawyer, and clinical psychologist Dr. Samantha Masley. I'll give you all a short introduction of today's session, then I'll pass over to Elizabeth and Samantha for some personal introductions, and then we'll get started. So after an incident at work, investigators rely heavily on witness accounts to understand key factors around what happened. However, human memory is not a perfect recording of what happened. In this webinar, Elizabeth and Samantha will unpack the science of witness memory and what this means for the way you investigate, document, and defend incidents. You'll leave with a better understanding of the psychology and neuroscience of this area, practical steps you need to take in the event of an incident, and an awareness of how this area can help in the defence of prosecutions. For those of you who aren't familiar with Notify Technology, we are a health and safety software partner that helps organisations proactively manage risk and stay on top of compliance without the complexity that often comes with it. We work closely with safety leaders not just to provide a platform, but to drive real measurable impact. Whether it's incident management, audits, or risk assessments, our flexible platform is designed to be simple enough for everyone to use, from frontline workers through to senior leaders. Effective incident management means understanding the full picture of what happened, and that's exactly what we're here to explore today. We will have time to answer some questions from you guys at the end, so you should see a Q&A tab at the top of Teams. Please feel free to add any questions here during the session, and we will get to those at the end. So let's start off with some introductions. Elizabeth, could you tell us a little bit more about yourself?
Thanks so much, Greta, and good afternoon, everybody. Yes, I'm Elizabeth Hyde. I'm a director of HESPA GRC. We specialise in training and consultancy work around psychological safety, and we also run workshops around witness memory, the neuroscience and psychology around that as well. As Greta mentioned, I worked previously as a health and safety lawyer. I was a senior lawyer in an international law firm. I worked there for just under 17 years, and in that role, I essentially investigated and defended organisations against criminal prosecutions and investigations, so typically those brought by the HSC and local authorities. So I've a lot of experience interviewing witnesses after serious incidents. And I'll pass over to Samantha.
Yes, thank you. I'm Samantha. I'm a clinical psychologist, so my background is a little bit different. I have worked in the field of trauma, treating people that have had significant things that have happened to them in their lives. And from my perspective, it's that experience of working with people that perhaps are frustrated by their own memory or finding it difficult to recall certain aspects that perhaps other people have thought they should be able to recall, and it's all that kind of emotional impact of the memory not working as people would like. I also have some experience of being an expert witness and writing reports for the court on the emotional impact that things have had on people, and perhaps helping to unpick why people's narratives are perhaps different or changing or not consistent with another witness's reflection on something. So that's me.
Fantastic, thank you both. So we'll get into it. Elizabeth, just to start off, why is understanding witness memory important for EHS investigations?
When I look back to when I used to interview witnesses, I would often find that a witness's evidence would change over time. And when I used to conduct those interviews, I would be very suspicious as to why a witness's evidence would change. I would sometimes consider maybe they were collaborating with other witnesses, maybe they were trying to protect a colleague or the business. But actually what I was seeing was something entirely consistent with how witness memory works, because witness memory does not work like a perfect recording. As when we encode memories in the brain, we don't encode them like a perfect computer file. And so that's really important to be aware of when people are conducting EHS investigations, because sometimes when someone's interviewing witnesses and witness evidence, witness accounts differ, people may presume that one witness is not potentially telling the truth, when in fact it could simply be the way in which that memory has been encoded. With EHS investigations, it's often following quite a stressful event, and Samantha will talk about the impact of stress on witness memory shortly, but being aware of that impact of stress is also really essential. Similarly, after an incident, it's more likely than not that witnesses will want to talk to each other if something unusual's happened on site, something quite stressful's happened on site. And again, this is where witness evidence can become very quickly contaminated. So understanding how witness memory works, how fallible memory is really important for improving the quality of an investigation and the report that subsequently follows. And another point just to be aware of is having a really good understanding of witness memory could also potentially help avert a prosecution. Samantha and I have worked with various teams delivering training around this topic, and we've had reports back from some EHS lawyers how they've used some of this information to avert a prosecution of their client by a local authority.
Yeah, totally. I think, yeah, it's a really important foundation to set, isn't it? So yeah, absolutely. And are you seeing the criminal and civil courts taking an interest in this area, Elizabeth?
Yep, there's a great deal of interest that's been taken by the civil and criminal courts in this area. The judiciary are becoming more trained around, so better trained around this area. So whilst they will often believe that a witness is being honest, they will understand that memory is fallible. And there's some really interesting cases that have been coming out of the courts around this area. One of the perhaps the better known one is the case of Guestman and Credit Suisse, where the judge in that case, Mr. Justice Leggett, talked in great detail about how unreliable witness evidence can be, and how in that particular case he preferred the documentary evidence over and above what the witnesses were saying. Later cases have talked about the need for balance between looking at witness evidence and the documents. So there's a case, Grable Capital, and others, Barrow and Merritt, where they've talked again about looking at the evidence as a whole. A really interesting speech was given by Lord Justice Popplewell to Combar about how understanding witness memory is a really important part of a lawyer's toolkit. So something that is definitely on the radar of the courts. So yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it kind of really cements the fact that it's not just best practice, there's real implications, isn't there? So yeah, that totally makes sense. So what sort of things can distort witness memory, Samantha?
Well, there's lots of things that can interact with our memory because it's kind of an organic process. It sort of interacts with our environments. So there are three basic parts of memory. We have our encoding stage where our brains are trying to sort of take in what we're seeing or experiencing or what's happening. Then we've got the storage where it's trying to keep hold of it and keep the file safe and secure. And then we've got the retrieval where it's downloading that information and trying to send it back out into the world. So we've got those three different areas of memory. And they are all influenced to a certain degree by things like stress. So if there's lots of anxiety, lots of fear, then those hormones start to affect the way that the memories are being accessed. So we might prioritize encoding the stress information and leaving out other bits that the brain decides is less important. So we might drop really big things that were happening at the time because they didn't seem important. In terms of storing information, we kind of things that we not use quickly drop away, so we can see really fast declines of memory that's not fully encoded into a long-term system. And when we're trying to get it back out, so stress has a big impact on all of those, but also things like schemas. So we all have blueprints and expectations of how something's going to go. So sometimes if something doesn't go as our blueprint expects, then we either twist it to make it more aligned with what we're expecting. And sometimes if we have lots of things that are very routine to us, the brain doesn't bother storing each as separate files. It just clubs them all together and blends information together. So in terms of distorting, there's stress, there is our schemas that might change it, talking to different people, so we can have things like social conformity, which we're going to cover a little bit later, but just that kind of wanting to kind of go along with other people. And also we sometimes have pride and wishful thinking comes in. We sometimes can twist information in our brains to make it more compatible with how we see ourselves, or how we want to see ourselves, or how we want to be perceived. So yeah, lots of things that can affect how memories are stored.
Yeah, I think as well, just thinking about sort of an incident in the workplace, a lot of these factors will definitely be at play. So it's quite likely that distortion kind of will occur in those instances. So yeah, it's something to really think about.
Unfortunately, yes. Yeah.
You did touch on schemas. Could you just tell us, sorry, a little bit more about what that is and how it specifically impacts memory?
Yeah. So our brains try to cut down on their workload. So when we encounter something that's completely new and novel, there's lots of work going on in the background there. So, for example, the first time we enter IKEA, like a well-known shop, then it's quite an experience. It's quite novel for the brain, and it doesn't know what to expect. It's entered into this new world kind of thing. But if our brains then try to protect us next time by creating almost like a little template, a little schema map, so that we know roughly what kind of shop that is, the types of things that might be there. They're not factually perfect, and they're not designed to be. They're designed to be kind of a fallback, to mean that next time we've got some kind of anticipation of what to expect from that environment. The same for things like coffee shops and things like that. We've got these general blueprints. We expect there to be drinks within a coffee shop and tables, and we expect to pay. So our brains are trying to create these templates to help us out in those situations. And most of the time they do help us out, but sometimes they can become unhelpful when something significant happened, because the brain doesn't ask our permission to insert information. So, for example, maybe one day we, I don't know, forgot to pay in a coffee shop and walked out. The brain won't say, oh, I inserted the payment for you. It will just kind of like add bits in. So somebody might say, oh, and after I paid, then this thing happened, without directly remembering the paying part. So they can be very helpful most of the time, but every now and again, these same schemas that are designed to assist can sometimes create problems when people are trying to recall information.
Would it be okay to say, Samantha, as well, or right to say that, so if you had a health and safety incident and say somebody works on a piece of machinery, that's how they've always worked on that piece of machinery, their schema is this is how it works. It could well be the case that after an incident, they are remembering what they did based on the schema of working on that machinery. This is just how we do it. Similarly, the person who's interviewing them could have their own schema about how that work is typically conducted on that machine. And that may well influence the way in which they ask questions about what happened because of their schema.
Yeah, absolutely. And that would be fine if our brain said, alert, alert, I'm using your template for this. But they don't. It just kind of trips out of our mouths, and so it can be very difficult to know what is coming from the direct experience and what parts are kind of a bit more blank in the brain and the brain's inserting from the template. Yeah.
Brilliant, thank you. And could you tell me a little bit more about memory storage, Elizabeth? How long do we typically store memories for?
So there's been some really interesting research done on this, dating back, over 100 years. One of the most famous pieces of research around this is research conducted by Ebbinghaus, and he created the Ebbinghaus forgetting curve. And essentially, this chap back in the late 1800s, he tried to recall nonsense syllables, and he tried to see how long he could remember these nonsense syllables for. And what he found was there was this particularly a sort of, if we had a graph up here, there'd be a forgetting curve. So after an hour, you would forget about 44% of the information. After a day, you would forget 33% of the information. And after a month, you would only remember about 21% of the information. So there's a real drop-off of memory. But of course, when you're interviewing and conducting investigations within your organisations, you're not interviewing witnesses who've remembered nonsense syllables, but similar research conducted after the 9/11 attacks, where they interviewed about 3,000 individuals across the US. They asked them to remember a piece of information after 1 week after the attacks, 11 months later, and about 3 years later. And what they found was that there's a similar sort of forgetting curve where memory drops off very, very quickly at the beginning, but then tends to stabilize after a 1-year period. So a couple of things to take away from that. One is it's really important to conduct interviews as quickly as possible after an incident. So if you can, if you're in a large organization with multiple sites, get to site very, very quickly, get those interviews conducted as soon as possible. Of course, being aware of legal privilege, it's a topic for another day, but if you've got an in-house legal team, talk to them about legal privilege, because you need legal privilege in place before you interview witnesses. I'm happy to answer separate questions on that later, but interview as quickly as you can. The second thing to be aware of is often in legal cases, it's worth considering whether to run what lawyers would call an abusive process argument, whereby you say, actually, it would be unfair to prosecute our organisation because of the lapse of time since the incident happened. Witnesses will have forgotten everything. But what this research is showing, that although memory drops off very quickly at the beginning, it will stabilise after a year. And often prosecutions aren't brought for many, many years in a case. And so that argument about there being an abusive process might be potentially challenged because of this stabilisation of memory after a year. Having said that, as Samantha's mentioned already, this social conformity, witnesses talking to each other, could really contaminate witness evidence. So there is possibility of challenge, but just things to be aware of, really.
Yeah, absolutely. No, thank you very much. So what other areas of psychology should EHS professionals be considering? I'll come to you first, Elizabeth.
Bias is a good one to be thinking about here. Not only their own bias, if you're interviewing a witness, you might have your own view as to what may or may not have happened, but also an area to be conscious of is something called hindsight bias. It's particularly relevant for health and safety investigations because humans are not very good at assessing risk in hindsight, and often that knowledge of an event can really colour our view as to whether that event was reasonably foreseeable or not. So being aware of hindsight bias is really, really important. You can often find witnesses saying it's clearly an accident waiting to happen, and yet actually, if the event hadn't happened and you were to interview somebody, they may well not have even spotted that could have been a risk that may eventuate. So being aware of hindsight bias is really important.
Yeah, perfect. And do you have anything to add on that, Samantha?
There's another area as well which can come in, which is the social conformity side. So there's some, I don't know if anybody's seen, but they did some lovely research where they were running people in a lift, and so everybody else in the lift was part of a study, so that they were all participants in a study, and then a member of the public would get in, and they wanted to see what the member of the public would do if everybody else in the lift was facing in the wrong direction. And nearly each time, the member of the public, even though it would be illogical to stand looking at the back, they saw everybody else doing that and moved around. So social conformity is a really powerful thing. It's not something that we're necessarily thinking about. It's not something that's like up here in our cognitive minds, but it is something that impacts how we behave and how we respond. So here we often have a degree to kind of, we're aware of people in authority and people in power, and so we're more likely to shift our views if we feel like somebody senior has different views to ourselves. So that can be coming in investigations as well, people perhaps noticing other people's thoughts. And I guess this is where the timing comes in, because if there's a big gap between an incident happening and an investigation taking place, then people might have had lots of opportunity to talk to other people. And at that point, there might be this kind of gentle shaping of a narrative that's happening in an unconscious way, but is still shifting the way that person might then recall it later. So yeah, social conformity as well.
And just to add to that, if I may, you can also see this a little bit. I don't know if anybody's been following the Lucy Letby case, where I think some people are trying to put forward the case that she might be innocent. Some really interesting is on BBC iPlayer, some documentaries around it. You can also see social conformity as well with the alleging this in terms of expert reports as well, because the experts building that allegiance with one side, and there's some criticism that's been made on this documentary about the expert in the Lucy Letby trial, potentially around this sort of social conformity piece, where they've got such a stake in trying to find her guilty. But I'm not making any comment myself on the my views on that, but yeah, interesting around that social conformity piece. And I think perhaps Samantha, we could mention the attentional blindness piece that you talked about a little bit earlier on. There's some really good studies around. You might have seen the video of the gorilla, where the students are passing a ball between themselves, and during the video you're asked to watch how many times the players with white t-shirts pass the ball to each other, and you don't spot the gorilla walking in between them all and beating his chest and then walking off. And about 50% of participants don't notice this gorilla walking on the stage whilst this test is going on. And it's that point about attentional blindness. We're not all spotting things. And so if one witness says they didn't see something entirely obvious, it may well be that they're telling the truth and they're not lying. It simply could be that point around attentional blindness.
Yeah, it sounds like there's a lot more to this area than maybe people first realise. It's really interesting, especially all those different studies. So Samantha, how does stress impact witness memory then?
Well, the way I conceptualize it is that our brains are like these big information libraries, and when we're feeling relatively secure and calm, there's lots of lights on there, and we can kind of wander around the library, gather information from different parts. Lots of information's accessible to us. But when stress comes into play, or fear, anxiety, those kind of things, then the brain mode shifts, and it's almost, it turns off certain parts of the brain, really prioritizing other parts. So there's like a big blasty kind of beam that goes to kind of relevant information, but other areas have become darker to kind of fuel that shift. So in particular, when stress hormones start to get released, the area that they have a big impact on is the hippocampus. And the hippocampus is a part of the brain that's busy time stamping and sequencing and organizing our information. So when kind of shocking and highly stressful things happen, our brain stops organizing information in the same way, and it can find it difficult to figure out times around things and things like that. So it's more to do with areas of the brain not being ready to help and other areas being more active. So if you're wanting those, for example, the prefrontal cortex to be online, time stamping, we want in stress to be as low as possible. And obviously with big incidents, that's just not always possible. Our bodies react there. We're humans. We find lots of information quite distressing, but it's not just at the event time, it's when we're recalling it as well. It's hard for us to think about and recall information that's emotive and difficult. And so we can sometimes find that we're in this almost like a mode of operation that makes it harder for us to access certain information that is perhaps more accessible when we're calm and feeling more secure.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah. So what sort of practical steps should people be thinking about when they're preparing or conducting a witness interview, Elizabeth?
So the first thing would be interviewing early, which I mentioned before. So interviewing as quickly as you can, particularly after an incident. You may well need more time to prepare a wider interview around training and supervision and so on and so forth, but to find out the facts of what actually happened at the time of the incident, to get that done quickly is really important. I would keep witnesses separated, keep them separate where practical. Encourage them to not talk about the facts of the incident until they've been interviewed, not because anyone's pointing the finger of blame or anything like that, but just simply because of that risk of contaminating evidence. Of course, as soon as an incident, something serious happened, people will naturally want to talk. Employees will go home, talk to their families about what they've seen. They might talk to the emergency services and so on and so forth. And every single time one of those conversations happens, it has that potential to start influencing memory. So the sooner those interviews happen, the better. Another recommendation I have would be to follow what the police might call the TED approach. So TED being the acronym for tell, explain, and describe. So when you're interviewing a witness, try and keep really open questions to begin with, so far as you can. So tell me what happened. You mentioned X, explain what you mean by that, and describe in more detail what you meant by X, Y, or Z. So trying to keep those open questions it's really important rather than leading questions, because as soon as you start to put certain vocab or words or things like that, you can start to influence the witness's memory. Samantha, I don't know if you're going to be talking shortly about that study about the cars and the smashed and the hit use of language. I don't know if that's something, or if you want me to cover that now.
You cover that.
Should we
Do that now.
Shall I cover that now?
Yeah.
So there was a really interesting study done where they had a group of participants in a psychological study, and they got them to watch a video of a car crash. They then split the participants into two groups and interviewed the two groups separately, each individual separately. In one group, they asked the participants how fast were the cars going when they hit each other. And the other group, they asked the participants how fast were the cars going when they smashed into each other. Now, the group that was in the smashed into category gave a much higher speed, typically as to how fast the cars were travelling. They also reported seeing glass. 32% of them reported seeing glass when there was no glass present. So just the very use of the words hit or smashed in the way in which that question was posed altered the way in which the evidence was given. Hence the need for that TED approach, keeping those questions really open and avoiding leading questions wherever possible. And these are really important points to think about, because this is a sort of thing that could pop up in trial later on. Questions about how witnesses were handled immediately after an incident, how quickly were they interviewed, who was interviewing them, how were they questioned, and so on and so forth. So being aware of this now, before an incident happens, could be really important.
Yeah, great, thank you. So how can you reduce stress during a witness interview? Samantha, come to you first for this one.
There's lots of little things that we can do. Power dynamics are one. So if we're trying to create a space where somebody's not perceiving like they're of low power in that situation, which can be really hard with interviews. So if somebody's coming in and they're controlling the questions and they kind of have ownership of that space. But in general, that type of thing makes us feel a bit more nervous, a bit more anxious, and then those stress hormones might come into play and make it harder for us to recall information. So just trying to be aware of that, be aware of, if we're conducting interviews, be aware of what we're wearing and communicate, not instead of power dressing, which we often do as a sign of respect and a sign of professionalism. For some people, that can then create some of those power dynamics and push some of those stress hormones up. And where we're conducting an investigation might be quite important as well. So our brains have these blueprints that we've referred to earlier, and they have blueprints for specific locations. So if we're using an office where somebody associates it with interviews, firings, like just negative things happening, then the body might start to move into that fight and flight just based on those environmental triggers. So just making sure that there's no real strong negatives where we're actually conducting the investigation. And the other thing to think about is that our nervous systems are giving signals to other people. So if we're in a fight flight state, other people can look at us and think, oh, what do you know that I don't know? And almost kind of move up into a bit more of a state of readiness and alertness based on our demeanor and our body language. So the types of things that we tend to do when we're feeling really secure and really safe, we are quite social, we are more chit-chatty, we are more conscious of our surroundings and point things out a little bit more. So those types of behaviours can be used to signal to the person that we're talking to, especially at the beginning of an interview, that everything's okay here. So just pointing things out around us and giving a little bit of time to chit-chat before we start some of the harder questions with people. I think that they would be the main ones that I can think of. There might also be things just to do with sensory that we should also be considering as well. So some people's brains will get full of certain things a little bit quicker than others. So just being mindful of lighting and temperature and whether there's fans and noise and things like that in the room around us, because things that some brains just tune out and don't notice, other brains can kind of jam on those things, and that can create stress that again changes their access to information. So those are the types of things I'd be thinking about. I think you might have a few as well, Elizabeth.
Yeah, I think the only other one I was going to add was just to build on that point about the beginning of the interview, just having a bit of time to have a bit of a chit chat with the witness just before you start that interview process, just to keep them relaxed. Often after a serious incident, you don't have time to get in touch with the witness in advance or write to the witness, email them or anything like that, to forewarn them about what the interview will, how it will be constructed, how it will be run. But of course, if there are follow-up interviews, then getting in touch with witnesses, or if there is a delay for whatever reason before a witness is interviewed, then just letting them know what to expect in the interview can sometimes reassure them a little bit. Just an introduction to the witness, pick up the phone to them to say you'll be interviewing them, and this is roughly how long it'll take. There'll be breaks, and so on and so forth. So I think that's probably the only thing to add at this point.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you. So finally, Elizabeth, you mentioned yourself and Samantha deliver training on this area for EHS professionals. Could you just tell us a little bit more about this and how any attendees can get in touch?
Yeah, sure. So Samantha and I have run various workshops for different teams. So we've run workshops for EHS teams, HR teams, a whole range of different litigation lawyers, from commercial litigators to real estate litigators to health and safety lawyers. So all different specialisms, and each workshop's very much tailored to the attendees. And so we run them online or in person, and they're very interactive. We've probably only sort of scratched the surface of this topic during this webinar. It's a very big topic, so there's a lot to learn in this area of psychology. So the workshops are interactive, and we do lots of little mini psychological experiments throughout to illustrate some of the research that's done in this area. So really to bring it to life, and it's lots of fun. So to get in touch, I'm on LinkedIn, Elizabeth Hyde, or I've got a website which is www.hespergrc.com. The GR stands for governance, risk and compliance. So it's hespergrc.com.
Brilliant. Thank you both very much. I think we've got time for a couple of questions, so we can dive straight into those. I know a few people who couldn't make today's session have also sent some in, so we'll get to those too. So the first one here, is there a danger that getting written statements down too quickly after an incident actually does more harm than good, because you're essentially locking in an unreliable account? And should there be some kind of waiting period before you formally start documenting things?
I would strongly recommend that the sooner the statements are taken, the better, for the reasons that we've talked about during this session, because memories will fade so quickly, witnesses will talk to each other, there's a risk of that, the risk of them talking to friends and family. So the sooner you can take the statement, the better.
Great, thanks. What one change could most EHS teams realistically implement tomorrow that would make a real difference to the quality of witness accounts they're getting?
I think, well, I've got a number of changes, to be honest, but I think probably the starting point would be speaking to your teams, those who would be conducting witness interviews, speaking to them about witness memory and how it can be unreliable, even though the witness is being entirely honest and believes they're being 100% accurate, and that you can have two very honest witnesses with differing accounts, and that's okay. So I would do that. I'd be getting a protocol into place to make sure people are interviewing witnesses as soon as they can, and that they're trained to conduct those interviews. I think, well, forgive me, that's two changes. But yeah, Samantha, do you have anything that you'd add?
Try to keep stress levels low, be human, engage with people, to try and help steady their nervous systems. Yeah. Yeah, we cheated there. We have a few.
What happens if a company's documentation tells slightly different stories at different points? So, for example, the initial report says one thing and a later statement says something else. How much damage does that actually do? And is there anything to sort of recover the situation when that happens?
In terms of it damaging a case, I suppose there's a potential for that, depending on what reports were saying. But what I would say to that is, the courts, and that case I mentioned earlier, Guestman and Credit Suisse, they've looked at this in quite a lot of detail about documentary evidence being potentially preferable to witness evidence. Later cases have said, no, let's look at everything in the round. So I think to answer that point, I would say, look at everything, look at all the evidence in the round to assess it. I think I would look at who has created those documents. So what experience do they have? What level of expertise did they have when they created those documents? Because one of the things that is quite clear about documents is sometimes people go, well, a witness statement can't be as reliable as a contemporaneous document, but whoever's created a contemporaneous document has been relying on their memory in any event. So there are also challenges can be had of those documents. So I think about it in the round, look at all the evidence around to assess it properly. Think about things like when the documents were created, and so on and so forth. So it's sometimes difficult to say which would be the most accurate, which is the most reliable, depending on who's created it, when it was created, and what other information has come to light around those things.
This one here is just around hindsight bias, which I know you touched on earlier. So hindsight bias feels like one of those things that's almost impossible to get around. Is there anything that investigators can actually do to combat that? Or is it more just around being aware that it's a thing?
In terms of hindsight bias, there is actually quite a bit of interesting psychological research around this that's been done into judges and juries looking at events and applying their own hindsight bias. And there's a lot to suggest that they do apply hindsight bias in cases. And I think there was a case, some research done back in 2016 around this, which I can dig out if anybody is interested in it. But I think what the research was showing was that encouraging people to explicitly think about the counterfactuals around how something should have played out can provide some form of effective means of reducing that risk of hindsight bias. So flagging the concept of hindsight bias to a judge and jury, or in the case of an internal investigation, being aware of that if you are conducting an investigation is important.
Great, thank you. And there's also just a question here asking whether we could share the cases again from the session. So just to add, this recording of this webinar, sorry, will be available shortly, and we'll upload that to the Notify Technology YouTube channel. So you'll be able to revisit this and share it with any colleagues who couldn't join today. But also there's the contact details that Elizabeth mentioned earlier as well. I'm sure you won't mind if anyone gets in touch.
Oh no, that's absolutely fine. If you want to just connect maybe on LinkedIn or by email, just let me know. I'll put my email address in the chat function here, and then I'll dig out the cases for you.
Thanks for that. Great. Well, I think we'll have to end it there for today. But thank you everyone for joining, and thank you to Elizabeth and Samantha for the really insightful session. I thought that was really interesting. If you'd like to learn more about some of the themes discussed today and how Notify can help, you can visit our website. So that's notifytechnology.com. And here you can book a demo of our health and safety software with our friendly team. Also just wanted to flag 2 events you can find Notify at this week. So if you're in London, we'll be at Safety, Health and Wellbeing Live at Olympia London on the 1st and 2nd of July. And if you're in the West Midlands, we'll also be at HSM Live in Coventry on the 1st of July. So please feel free to drop by our stands at these events if you'll be there and see how we can help. But thanks once again for joining, and we'll hopefully see you again soon.